Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. I'm your host, Jason Natick. If there's one thing that most parents have in common, it's this. They want a better life for their children. Well, a post-secondary education can be one of the keys to helping their children get there. Case in point, over half of the top 10% wealthiest Canadians hold a university degree, according to Statistics Canada. Of course, higher education isn't cheap, as anyone who's seen tuition rates can attest. That's what makes a registered education savings plan, or RESP, such a useful tool for Canadians. It can help parents invest for their children's education thanks to tax-deferred growth and government grants it offers. Now that said, there's plenty of debate as to how to get the most out of this account. So we're going to crunch the numbers on some different possibilities with the help of our guest speaker. Joining us here today is Matt Poyner. He's the founder of the investing blog Dividend Strategy. Matt, always great to have you here on the show. Thanks for swinging by today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jason.
All right, outstanding. All right, a little bit of maybe background on you. How did the RESP help you save for your own children's education?
Well, my story is maybe a little bit unusual because my official training is actually as a physician, and as a physician here in Canada, I was actually incorporated. There's benefits of incorporation for physicians, and one of those used to be that you could potentially give your kids dividends when they became adults. And so that really rendered the RESP less relevant for me as a physician. But unfortunately, those rules changed about 5 years ago. And so in 2018, I had to all of a sudden really pay close attention to an RESP, because that became our best option to help pay for our 4 children to hopefully go to post-secondary education. So I kind of took it on as a project to learn everything that I could about RESPs. Because really it was in our best interest to learn how to optimize them. So I guess I'm here with you today to share what I have discovered.
So it sounds like you were drinking through a bit of a financial fire hose there. So I know our audience will benefit from your own personal experience. All right. Now, before we get into our conversation, I have a trivia question for our audience. What percentage of Canadian families with children younger than 18 had opened an RESP as of 2019? And we'll reveal the answer at the end of our conversation, so stay tuned. All right, let's get into our conversation here. First off, let's lay some groundworks for those in the audience who may not be entirely familiar with the RESP. How does it work at a high level, Matt?
When it comes to an RESP, putting money into that account, the money that you contribute to an RESP is after tax dollars. So you don't get a tax deduction like you would for that closely named account, the RRSP. You need to contribute with after tax dollars. So that's the first thing. The maximum contribution room in an RESP per child is $50,000, but there is no annual maximum. It's just the total max that matters. So $50,000 per kid. But the interesting thing about the RESP, and one of the main benefits of it, is that the government will match your contributions up to 20% of the first $2,500 per year. So the maximum, that's called a CESG, or Canada Education Savings Grant. So the maximum you can get from the government per year per child is $500 per child. So that's 20% of $2,500. And the maximum CESG per child over their lifetime is $7,200. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, how the money goes into the account. And then the rest is fairly simple. When it's inside the RESP, all of the investment returns that are generated within the account are completely tax-free. And then lastly, when money comes out of the account, then it is taxed in the hands of the child as long as they are enrolled in some kind of post-secondary institution. And that money can be used for anything, not just tuition, but also room and board and transportation. It's very, very flexible in terms of how that money can be used.
And what are some of the other potential benefits that investors and families may have by using an RESP?
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits to the RESP. It's a really powerful tool. So I think the first benefit is the CESG, that basically free money that you get from the government, 20% of your contributions up to $500 per year. Basically what that equates to is the way I think about it is it's a guaranteed 20% rate of return on your money. So I think that's the first really powerful benefit of an RESP. The second one is that you get tax-free growth within the account. So you get the tax deferral, and that will supercharge that compounding phenomenon that we're all familiar with as investors. And then the last thing is that when the money comes out in the hands of the child, it's essentially like a tax-free withdrawal. If there's any tax owing on it, it'll be minimal, because presumably the other income for that student is going to be very low. And so there's probably not very much tax owing in the first place. And they'll also be eligible as a student in a post-secondary education institution for student tax credits and things like that. So essentially, a good way to think about an RESP is that it basically functions like a TFSA. It is funded with after-tax dollars, but tax-free growth inside, and then the money is taken out basically tax-free, but with the added benefit that you get that 20% CESG.
Yeah, that 20% kind of rate of return, like you put it, is a very interesting kind of way to frame that thought exercise, and really kind of gives a nice additional benefit to the account. So that's a really interesting, like I said, thought process. Now, what happens if an investor doesn't contribute enough to maximize the government grants that they're eligible for each year? Is that lost forever?
No, not lost forever, but you can only catch up 1 year at a time. Say, just to give an example, say you've got a 5-year-old child and you have just thought to open an RESP now, or you have the ability to open and fund an RESP. That 5 years that you didn't contribute to the RESP, you can catch up for that 5 years, but 1 year at a time. So rather than receiving $500 of CESG, you can receive up to $1,000 of CESG money for each of those 5 years that you missed. So when the child's 5 years old, rather than contributing $2,500, if you have the ability to contribute $5,000, you would receive $1,000 in CESG money. And you could do that for the next 5 years until you're caught up. And then you could go back to the $2,500 and go back to the $500 in CESG money.
That's nice to hear. A bit of flexibility. Maybe you financially don't have the wherewithal to be able to put that contribution in, or maybe the timing just isn't right, but you've got an opportunity to double up until you've caught yourself back up. So that's a nice bit of information to learn. Now, there are two different types of RESPs out there: a family plan, or really what's called an individual plan. What are the key differences to consider here?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the family RESP is probably the most common RESP. And what a family RESP means is that you can have more than one child or more than one beneficiary registered to that account. And then as the assets grow within the accounts and the funds grow within there, when it comes time to withdraw those funds, they can be used for any of the children that are registered under that account. And here's the key: in any proportion. So if one child actually doesn't go to post-secondary education at all of the money could potentially be used for the other one. So there's a lot more flexibility with a family RESP in terms of how the funds are used down the road. The only real limitation to it is who can be the subscriber to the RESP. So that means who can contribute to it. And so it has to be opened by somebody that the government deems a blood relative. So essentially that's a parent, step-parent, grandparent, step-grandparent, or even a sibling can open a family RESP for a beneficiary. So the other type of RESP, which is slightly less common, is an individual RESP. As you say, the other name for that is a specified RESP because it's specific to an individual. And really the main benefit of that is that if you are not a blood relative of the child, you can still open an RESP and help support their post-secondary education. So that could be aunts and uncles. It could even be a family friend or something like that.
And a keynote to the audience, here at TD Direct Investing, we open family plans, and I know I've got an account, and I find it convenient to have the family plan because I get to manage one account for both of my children, as opposed to having two different accounts to worry about. So it's a nice convenience, and it allows to really to kind of just make things just as easy as possible. So that's just so you know what you're getting yourself into when you're opening up an RESP here with us. All right. Now, some parents out there might want their children to help save and invest for their own education. So check out our webinar, How to Help Motivate Your Children to Invest, with guest speaker Michelle Hung. It's available in the Learning Center on Webbroker and on TD's YouTube page. All right, we understand the rules around contributing funds to an RSP. Now let's talk about getting it out. How does that process work?
There's essentially three parts to an RESP, and it's important to understand them because of how the money eventually comes out of the RESP. So it's safe to think of a TFSA or an RRSP, for example, as one basket of money with different investments inside. But an RESP is a little bit different. So the three components are, number one, the contributions that you have put into that RESP. Number two, the CESG money that the government has put into the RESP. And then number three, whatever investment returns you've earned over the life of the RESP. So it's keep those in mind. Now, when you go to make a withdrawal from an RESP, you can actually select whether you are withdrawing something called an EAP, which stands for Educational Assistance Payment, or a PSE, which is post-secondary education payments. So what the EAP withdrawals refer to is that you are withdrawing from that pool of money that's a combination of the CESG and investment returns, versus the PSE money is from the actual contributions that you've paid into the account that you've already paid tax on. So that's really that's why those distinctions matter. When you're withdrawing that PSE money, so that's from your contributions, you've already paid tax on those contributions, so it's not taxable again. But if you're withdrawing from the EAP portion, which is a combination of the CESG and the investment returns, that actually is taxable because that's money that CRA has not taken their cut of yet. So you get to make a choice when you actually make the withdrawal. Either way, there's usually little or no tax, like I said before, because usually these students have very limited income and access to those student tax credits.
And those acronyms are broken down just for the audience's benefit on the withdrawal forms to start taking money out of those RESPs. So rest assured, you'll be supported at every step of the process when you are looking to begin taking money out. All right, so on that note of withdrawals, is there a particular order that generally makes sense to withdraw the different types of funds from within an RESP?
Usually it makes sense to draw out the EAP first, so the educational assistance payments, that taxable portion, because it's usually in the first phase of their education that their income from other sources is going to be lowest. Particularly like our oldest son, for example, is going to be going into engineering. And so later on in his degree, chances are he's going to be doing co-op placements and earning money. So it's going to be in his best interest to draw out the taxable portion first when his tax rate is otherwise very low, and save the tax-free portion for later on in his degree. The one thing to understand about that, though, is that there is the only limitation to the withdrawals from the RESP in the hands of the student is that there's a maximum of $5,000 of the EAP portion that can be withdrawn within the first 13 weeks of their school year.
Okay, interesting. Interesting to know. What happens to the money inside an RESP if the child decides not to pursue a post-secondary education?
The first option is you could just leave the money in the RESP. An RESP can remain open for, I think it's 36 years. And that might be the best option for some people because, these kids are trying to find themselves and, maybe post-secondary education isn't right for them, like right at age 18. Maybe they need to take a year or 2 or 3 off and then they maybe come back to it. And if they do decide to come back to it, it'd be nice to have some financial support there. So first option is to leave it in there. But the second and third options, if they are not going to be needing or using that money, then the second option is that you can actually transfer the funds from an RESP to your RRSP. There are some limitations there and some conditions that you should research and look into. But if you have the contribution room, the bottom line is that in almost every case, you can usually transfer up to $50,000 from the RESP to your RRSP. If there's money beyond that you want to transfer over, then there's a penalty that goes along with that, and I believe it's 20%. But the third option is that you can just close the RESP. And in that case, again, going back to thinking about how there's those different components of RESP money, those contributions that you've made that you've already paid tax on, those can come out tax-free if or when you close the RESP. The CESG money, that money that came from the government, has to be returned to the government. And then those investment return components, then those would be basically come out and be taxed at your marginal tax rate plus a 20% penalty, I think, just to make up for the time that you've been able to enjoy the tax deferred growth on those investments.
It's comforting to hear that you've got some time to decide. And I like your advice about just giving it some time in the RESP, because maybe your children are going to maybe take some time to get into school, or they're going to take a gap year, maybe to do some traveling, whatever the case may be. Not everybody has their life figured out when they're 18 years old. That's going to take time. But when the time comes to kind of flatten out that RESP, then there's some pretty clear rules in place. So that's once again comforting to hear. All right. Now that we understand how RESPs themselves work, let's crunch some of the numbers to figure out the best way to save inside of one. The first contribution strategy that you were going to talk about here is to maximize the CESG. What would this look like?
The reason why you asked to talk to me today is because I really took it on as a project to figure out how to optimize the RESP. And because of the flexibility in how we could contribute to this account, there's a couple of variations. The first variation that I tested is what I call the maximize the CESG option. So I tested this one first because this is a really common approach to using the RESP. Just maximize the CESG by contributing $2,500 every year. That way you get the maximum $500 CESG every year. Now, if you do a little bit of mental math, you can see that if you contribute $2,500 every year for 18 years, you're not going to quite reach that $50,000 maximum contribution room. So in this example, you would have to contribute an extra $5,000 in that last year. So $7,500 in the last year rather than $2,500. So if you do all that and you assume a 6% rate of return, then by the time the student is going to post-secondary education at the end of the year 18, there'd be a little over $100,000 in the RESP. About $101,000. And if you break that down, about half of that would have come from your contributions. You would have had $7,200 in CESG money, and then about $44,000 or so from investment income.
Okay. The second contribution strategy is to maximize the lifetime contribution limit of $50,000 up front. This obviously isn't something every family can manage, but what might be the result with this approach?
Yeah, exactly. This isn't something that I commonly come across as being something that's really feasible for most families, but I think it's worth running through this scenario. And so that we can compare it to the other one, so that we can really understand one benefit, which is of front loading the RESP and getting as much money tax sheltered as soon as possible. So with this example, if you did have $50,000 that you could just dump into the RESP right up front in year one, you would only get $500 in CESG money for that year, and then you would get no more CESG after that. But on the other hand, you would have 18 years of tax-free compounding investment growth in there. So again, if you assume an average rate of return of 6% per year, then by the end of 18 years, you would actually have about $144,000 in the RESP. So that's about $43,000 more than strategy number one. But that can be a little bit deceiving, as I think we're going to talk about in a second. But just to break it down again, like I did for the last scenario, of that $144,000, $50,000 would come from your contribution, only $500 this time from CESG, and then the rest, about $93,000, $94,000 from investment income.
Don't sleep on the power of compound interest, everybody. Every time you have one of these data sets thrown out, it always kind of blows my mind how powerful of an ally compounding can be.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So now you made a great point in your blog post about RESPs that we shouldn't ignore the time value of money, that a parent could be investing elsewhere instead of front loading the RESP. So, how does these strategies compare when you're adjusting for this?
Yeah, exactly. So that scenario number two there, even though the final balance is higher, it can be a little bit misleading because if you had $50,000 to invest, of course, investing it as a lump sum in the RESP right up front is going to beat scenario one. But if you think about it for a second, if you had $50,000 to invest, you could it go with option number one and then invest the rest elsewhere. So like in a TFSA, for example. So that's what I did in order to try to get a true apples to apples comparison of the front load strategy versus the maximizing the CESG strategy. So in that front load strategy where you dump $50,000 in right up front, it all goes into the RESP. But say you were to put that, have that $50,000 in a TFSA, what we could do in order to really get a good comparison is in year one, we take $2,500 from that TFSA and put that into the RESP. And so you're left with $47,700 in the TFSA to continue to grow. And then in the next year, you put another $2,500 from the TFSA into the RESP and so on. So each year you're taking from the TFSA and you're putting it into the RESP and you're getting the CESG that goes along with that money. So that was the next scenario that I ran. And if you were to do that, by the end of 18 years, when you combine the values of the TFSA, or that separate account, and the RESP, you actually get a higher number than if you had just put the whole $50,000 into the RESP up front. You'd actually end up with about $157,000. So that's almost $13,000 more than that lump sum front loading strategy. So what that means is that investing a $50,000 lump sum into the RESP is probably not actually the best way to go, particularly if you still have unused RSP or TFSA room.
And finding young parents with a nest egg of $50,000 is can be can be few and far between. I'm sure as well. But this third approach that we're going to discuss, I think, is going to kind of marry the best of both worlds here. We'll call it the hybrid option. The first two strategies. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think this is really the punchline for the whole thing. With the hybrid option, you get the benefit of maximizing your contribution room. You also maximize the CESG, but you also get as much money as possible into that RESP as early as possible to benefit from the tax deferred growth. So it's actually quite simple to do. If you happen to have the money available, then contributing an extra $14,000 on top of the $2,500 in year one. So $16,500 in year one, followed by $2,500 every year thereafter. What that would accomplish is basically that would maximize your lifetime contribution room of $50,000. So by the time you reach year 18, you will have contributed the maximum amount that you're allowed. It would also maximize the CESG that you would get at $70,200. Now, when I ran the numbers with this, I assumed a 6% rate of return again. The RESP would be worth about $126,000 at the end of year 18. So that's about $24,000 more than strategy number one. Breaking that down, about, again, $50,000 comes from our contributions, $7,200 from the CESG, and then about $68,000, $69,000 from investment income. Now, it's worth noting that this strategy is definitely is going to be most beneficial if that extra money up front isn't stolen from your other registered accounts. You're all maximizing those at the same time, but instead this is coming from money that would otherwise have been in some kind of non-registered account.
That's a fantastic insight, Matt. Now that we've run through a lot of the numbers, so put a bow on it for us. What are the key conclusions you've drawn from the analysis that you've done?
Yeah, I think the key conclusions that I've taken away from looking at this is that the best approach, if you have the money, is probably the hybrid approach. Front loading with up to $14,000 extra in that first year, or really any amount of front loading is still going to benefit you. And then beyond that, if you have the ability to maximize the CESG, go ahead and do it with an additional $2,500 per year every year after that. But that's not to say that, if you don't have extra money around in that first year, that the second approach is, or really approach number one that we talked about today, about maximizing the CESG by contributing $2,500 per year. That's also a very, very powerful approach to funding the RESP and getting the benefit of that, like I said, guaranteed 20% rate of return that we get from the government, but also getting a fair bit of money growing on a tax deferred basis. If you are already maxing out your RSPs and your TFSAs and you have $50,000 laying around in a non-registered account, then front loading might be an option to consider there. Particularly, I would maybe consider it a little bit more strongly if I felt like the market was particularly attractively priced, versus if it seemed to be running at highs and maybe, ripe for some kind of correction, because people should bear in mind that, dumping that amount of money into investments all at one time, then you are taking on some sequence of return risks. So if the market were to crash soon after you invested and you were to have very low returns for the first portion of that 18-year time period, then the final outcomes could really suffer because of that.
All right. Now, I know this question, it triggers a lot of debate, but some parents might wonder how they might prioritize contribution to their various investing accounts. What's your take on that, Matt?
Yeah, fair question. And of course, this is totally individual. Everybody's circumstance is different in terms of, their goals, timeframes, risk tolerances, what is your tax rate now versus what it might be in the future. And all of these things do have an impact on these kinds of decisions. But it's tough to beat a 20% guaranteed rate of return on that first $2,500 of contributions to the RESP. So I think if you have children, you anticipate they're going to go to post-secondary education, and that's a value for you and your family. It's really tough to beat, using the RESP as a tool in order to accomplish that. Beyond that, if you are in a higher tax bracket, then I think an RSP is probably going to be the next most beneficial account for most people, just because you get to take advantage of that tax deduction that goes along with RSP contributions. Otherwise, if you're in a lower or medium tax bracket, then TFSA is also a super valuable and powerful account to take advantage of. And ideally, of course, hopefully most of us are going to be able to find a way to take advantage of all three of those tools, because they play different roles in each of our financial plan.
Right. They've got all their own benefits to come along with it. So you've got the financial kind of flexibility to take advantage of them all, then the more benefits back to you. So yeah, great point. Now, let's take a look at this from just a bit of a different scope here. What are some common mistakes that you've seen investors make with RESPs?
There's a temptation to think of the RESP as really just an extension of our other retirement accounts. And that's not really the best way to think about an RESP, because that money has a different time frame, different goals, potentially different risk tolerances. And so, that money, it's got a different reason for being there, and you're going to want it to do something different than that other pot of money. So I'd encourage people to think of the RESP as kind of its own little portfolio. And so the asset allocation in that portfolio needs to be appropriate for the goals and the time frame. And so just in general terms, when the kids are very young, you can probably have investments that are a little bit more risky, maybe a little bit more equity heavy. But then as their age progresses and they get closer and closer to needing that money, then that should probably shift more towards safer, less volatile investments. And one of my favorite ways of doing that is by simply building a GIC ladder when the kids get within 5 years of needing that money for post-secondary education. And that just, we can still have a bunch of that money invested for growth, but then we've got, the way I use it anyway, is 5 years of a guaranteed income stream that's going to be coming their way. So we don't have to worry that they're not going to have that money available to them when they need it to pay for their tuition, books, room and board, etc.
All right. Thanks for crunching the numbers for us, Matt. I'm sure it would be a big help to parents in the audience trying to save for their own children's education. We're going to have to wrap things up, but before we do, let's reveal the answer to our trivia question. As a refresher, the question was, what percentage of Canadian families with children younger than 18 had opened an RESP as of 2019? And the answer is, well, that's 53% of Canadian families with children under the age of 18 had opened an RESP as of 2019, according to data from Statistics Canada. The average amount of money held in those plans, well, that's $10,485. What do you think about that answer there, Matt?
Well, as with most of these accounts that we have available to us, it's kind of a shockingly low number, and I wish more people were taking advantage of this tool. In fact, I think with the higher costs of post-secondary education now, I'm hoping that the government is going to come out with an announcement at some point in time that the contribution limit is increasing, and maybe the CESG is going to increase as well, because even though everybody's very sensitive to inflation over the last couple of years for goods and services. The fact is that the cost of post-secondary education has been inflating at higher rates for quite a bit longer than just the last couple of years. So it's more expensive than ever to send your kid to get further education.
I'm sure you wouldn't get a lot of arguments from parents if you were to allow for higher contributions as well as those grants, those CESG increases. That would be welcome news. I'm sure. I know, and my household would love to hear all about that. All right, let's leave it there, Matt. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers?
No, I think we covered it off. RESP it's a great tool. Only 53% of people are actually using it, and maybe not, even if they have one open, maybe not using it to its fullest potential. So I hope that this helps people understand the RESP better, and maybe if more people understand it better and how it can be optimized, then maybe this will be like my little small part to helping increase those numbers. And of course, as always, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, you're the awareness we're bringing here today, and through your insight, I think will be a big benefit to a lot of people. But thanks again for joining us. And for those in our audience, make sure to register for our upcoming live webinars and check out our library of on-demand content. It's available in our Learning Center and on our YouTube page. We'll see you all next time.